having you join me in this endeavor. We call these political values and faith values. And really the idea is the Republican Party has stolen the branding of, if you're a Christian, you vote Republican. Yeah. Which I find it a hard thing to twist in my head, how you can be a Christian voter and not support public education, or be a Christian voter and not support healthcare, or be a Christian voter and not want everybody to have an opportunity to vote. And just on and on and on down the line, my values intersect with what the Democratic Party is trying to do. I may not agree with everything, certainly, but I certainly do agree that if I have to make a choice between Democrats and Republicans about who reflects the values that I understand are taught in Scripture and the values of which I try to live my life by, it's definitely the Democratic Party. So with me tonight are some special friends. Bill Jones took my place as executive director of Texas Baptist Committed, and Bill graciously sent me a little bio if I can find it. For a long time, he was an editor, and for the last good many years of my career at Texas Baptist Committed, Bill edited everything I wrote after Phil Strickland passed away.
Fun job.
And has continued to edit everything I write. He's continued to write everything I write 14 years after Phil's death. So Bill has been very active, of course, in Baptist life. He's chaired the T.B. Maston Foundation. He's on the Pastors for Texas Children board with me. Just a great human being. And so, Bill, we're glad to have you with us. We have Jeanie Miley, who, as I mentioned earlier, was my pastor. And she really was. She was as much my pastor as her husband, Martis, was. But Jeannie's really probably the most famous person on here because Jeannie's published 13 books.
Wow.
And I would encourage you to order some of those about spirituality and discipleship and growth. And she's a phenomenal writer. And Jeannie, one of my goals in retirement that I hope I reach sometime in the next year is to take a month and read every book Jeanie Miley wrote. That's one of my goals in retirement. So I look forward to that. Jeannie is currently she's a centering prayer facilitator. They're in marriage enrichment stuff that she and Martis are very active in. She's a graduate of Baylor, also a graduate of the Spiritual Direction Institute in Houston. She wrote a column for our local paper for 41 years. Every Saturday, Jeannie had a column in it. And so we welcome Jeannie and appreciate what she's done. Joe Grabowski is a new friend. Father Joe Grabowski has got quite the resume. He's got a Bachelor of Science from Georgetown University. He's got a Master of Arts with a specialty in security studies and religion and conflict from Georgetown. He has a Master of Sacred Theology from Agape Seminary in Forest, Virginia. And last week he was ordained a bishop in the Catholic Church. And I know he's quite pleased with that because he put 98 pictures of it on Facebook. Thank you, Joe. That was interesting to see.
Thank you.
And I know that was a special occasion for you. And so we welcome you and the insights you can bring us and in the areas, I think, of national security in some ways, and the ethics that are involved in that kind of thing. And finally, my longtime friend and great communicator, Roger Paynter, pastor of Northminster in Jackson, Mississippi, pastor of First Baptist Church, Austin, now very active teaching with the Disciples of Christ. The only thing that I can say about Roger that I wish I didn't have to tell you, he actually signed as a running back with the Oklahoma Sooners once upon a time.
Wow.
And for us Texans, we're not quite sure what to think about that. But that was one of his claim to fame. And one of his last claim to fame is he went to the Bob Seger concert with me in Austin last year, which was a lot of fun. Appreciate that, Paynter. Yeah. Now let's talk a little bit about what we want to say about our faith and our political values and how they join together. One of the things I want to address right at the start is the Supreme Court situation. Bill and Roger and Jeannie and I, Joe, because of our Baptist background, we understand what's going on, I think, a little bit better than anybody else in the country. In 1979, Jerry Falwell formed the moral majority. In 1979, a judge named Paul Pressler from Houston and Page Patterson started the fundamentalist takeover of the Southern Baptist Convention. They said it was because Baptists didn't believe the Bible. There was no truth to that ever. It was strictly an effort to align the Southern Baptist Convention with the Republican Party. And they have been successful. And the accumulation of that is going to be the appointment of Ms. Barrett to the Supreme Court. The agenda for these people has never been abortion. It's never been anti-homosexuality. It's never been any of those things. It is to make America a theocracy, to make America a Christian nation. David Barton's one of their big disciples who goes all over the country telling people that our founding fathers meant for this to be a Christian nation, meant for only Christians to hold office, only Christians to vote. And that's the biggest danger that is happening right now is Christian nationalism, the effort to actually do away with democracy and replace that democracy with theocracy, which is a part of what Ted Cruz has always been a part of. What about his father, Rafael Cruz, is a part of? It's called Christian dominion theology is a part of it if you want to Google that. But it's all a part of this effort to take control of the federal government for Christians only, which is no different than what we've battled all around the world, where there is not religious liberty and the separation of church and state. So if I would say anything to voters, the biggest threat right now is the loss of democracy in America, the loss of one person, one vote, and what that has always meant. And you couple that with the voter suppression activities and the other things. And to me, this is a huge ethical issue about why we as persons of faith that actually believe in the worth of every individual, regardless of religion or regardless of skin color. This is at the heart of what it means, in my opinion, to be a Christian. So at this point, I'm actually going to kick it to Jeanie Miley, who did not know I was going to do this, but she's as passionate about some of these issues as I have. And Jeanie, just share with us where your Christian values and the things you write about, how that influences your political values.
Well, I'm happy to. I don't know if I'm going to go where you want me to, but you can correct me at any point. But
you go where you want to.
I will. That's the Baptist way, right? So
Right.
hearing you, David, I've heard you speak about the takeover so many times and what's at stake, but I never heard you say it so succinctly and so powerfully as right now. And I thank you for that. It does bring back a lot of very painful memories for me, for all of us Baptists, as we watched what happened. And it's happening in the same thing that the takeover that happened in our denomination is the same thing that's happening at a national level. And we tried to tell people, and a lot of people told us it was just a Baptist war that we Baptists like to fight. And then the other churches began to be splintered as well over the same, are they red herrings? I don't know what, the same concerns. And I have heard Paul Pressler say on a tape, and you two have as well, that it was part of one of the greatest things he's done is to get good Baptists into the Republican Party, which I never knew that was the goal. My father was a Baptist minister for 40 years in Texas, and he was passionately for freedom, the freedom that we grew up in. And it involved the separation of church and state. It involved everybody being valued and everybody being free to worship as they please. So yes, I am very passionate about this. I am distressed over what's happening. I am hopeful that Joe Biden wins. And I was told today, which concerns me, I was told by a woman from Dallas that she's so worried about the country because if that criminal Joe Biden wins, then the country is doomed. And I would love to hear you all reflect on that. What's happened in the churches is really where I've lived and where my big concern is. And my father he preached this passionately back in the 50s and 60s. And he said, when the church takes its eyes off our founder and his teachings, founder of our faith, and he was Christocentric. He taught me that as a little girl. I was a little girl. He was my dad. But he said, when we take that out of the center of our belief system, the church loses its center and puts peripheral issues. Nevertheless, they might be important, but they're not the center of our faith. And I operate from the principle, I'm sure you all have heard this a zillion times from other people. My bedrock thing is I want my faith to inform my politics and not the other way around. So I frankly am both frightened about what I see in our culture. I am sad that a certain group of people who claim to be Christian, and I'm not questioning that. They could say that same thing about me. But I'm sad for what's happened, where I think the terrible marriage between politics and church have weakened both entities. And so, somebody asked me today why I was willing to do this. And this is not really my normal format to speak out on politics. As a preacher's kid and a preacher's wife, I've believed in not talking about religion and politics in public, but I think the circumstances are too dire right now. I think that it's very dangerous what is happening. I see good, well-meaning people. Almost some of them have been brainwashed. They say the same thing over and over to try to convince us. They come up to me as a woman and as a Baptist and as a writer in the Christian field and assume that I believe what they believe about guns, about children at the border, about this virus. They tell me it's a hoax. I think our culture has become so confused because of the consistent lying from the top down. People no longer know what to believe or whom to trust. And that's a sad day. So yeah, I'm speaking out. I was happy, David, that you asked me to do that. I don't know if I can contribute anything, but I am passionate about it. And one-on-one is my way of evangelism. I'm not much of a big crowd person.
Thank you, Jeanie.
What?
I got booted off there. A second. So thank you. I know you did well. And sorry that I wandered around in internet land for a second or two before I got there. Father Joe, I'd like to hear from you and talk about the ethical issues you see in this upcoming election.
Well, thanks, David. And I'd like to follow up on something that Jeanie said. There is an innate hypocrisy of what we're seeing now when an administration talks about religious freedom overseas, but undermines it at home. Mm-hmm. And what I laugh about is it, and I can't help it, and God forgive me for it, but every time I hear Mike Pence or Mike Pompeo talk about, how terrible the theocracy in Iran is, I laugh because I know that that's what they want to create the Christian version of here. And I tell my Catholic friends, you guys are siding with them, but guess who's the first one they're going to go after? It's not going to be the minority faiths. It's not going to be the Baptists. It's going to be us. We're the ones they're going to go after first. Yeah. And so we have this ridiculous hypocrisy, and it's both a spiritual and a mental dissonance, a psychological dissonance, where there's a complete lack of capacity of self-reflection of both the faith community that lines up behind this, but also the folks themselves who are leading it. And so, Jeanie, you mentioned something about, these people who call themselves Christian. I really appreciate the way you put that, because we can't judge somebody's heart. Only God can do that. But we can judge their actions.
Right.
And the reality is that if you say putting people in cages is fine, separating children from their parents is fine, denying people asylum is fine, denying people health care is fine, then you're not pro-life and you're not pro-Christian.
Right. Right.
And I don't mean to go down this road, but I have to, if you'll all excuse me. I have a real problem with the concept of pro-life when you only care about the fetus.
Yeah.
If you don't care what happens when the baby is born, and you don't care about the mother while she's carrying the baby, you're not pro-life, you're just anti-abortion.
That's right.
And let's just call it, call a spoon a spoon. That's exactly what it is. But if you are pro-life, you cannot vote for Donald Trump. And I do, every single Catholic priest and bishop that I hear say, well, you can't vote for Joe Biden if you're a Catholic. Are you kidding? Look, like David, I don't agree with the Democratic Party on everything. I can't. I don't agree with the Republican Party on anything nowadays under this guy. But at least we used to be able to find common values. We used to be able to find common ground. There was dignity, at least. There was humility. There was the capacity of Republican and Democratic House and Senate members going to dinner together after a debate on the floor, because it wasn't personal. It was just about the politics. But everything has been made so personal, and everything has been made so mean and angry that our faith has become mean and angry. And that's not the guy that we signed up to serve. That's not the guy who died on a cross. He wasn't mean and angry. He was humble. He was subservient. And he didn't even want to do it, but he did it. And so where is that humility in our politics and in our faith? And this is why I get angry with people who claim to be religious leaders and then speak in tongues that are not what Jesus spoke. And that's where I get very concerned that everybody's, I'll take that back. People line up behind these kinds of voices thinking that they're what Jesus wants because they carry the title pastor or father or bishop. But it's in the little actions. It's in the, did you feed the hungry? Did you clothe the naked? Did you give shelter to the homeless? You don't do those three most basic things, hard to call yourself a Christian.
Yeah, it's always
Pretty
interesting
good.
to me that Billy Graham's son is doing some of those things you just mentioned, and yet his behavior otherwise is so anti everything Christian. I mean, he's such a confusing person to me. Not really. He's sold out to the Republican Party for what good reason? Power alone, I guess.
Well, but there's a
Father, those are good words.
David, I'm sorry. Can I follow
ahead,
up on
Father.
Roger's point for a second?
Yes, go ahead, Jeff. Yes.
Roger, there's a great book out now by a young professor called Jesus and John Wayne.
I've heard about that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a brilliant book. I will encourage everybody who cares about these issues. And Jeannie, the way you speak so passionately, you would love the way she writes. It talks about how Christianity, starting in the 80s, became toxically masculine.
Mm.
And it's not about good or bad. It's not about what's right or what's wrong. It's about manning up. And, it's not about it's not about that wimp Jesus. It's about the Jesus who beat people up. And I keep saying to myself, when did we copy and paste Jesus out of the New Testament and put him in the Old Testament and forget about everything that he talked about in the New Testament?
Yeah.
I have his book. I have that book, not his. I have the book. And the John Wayne myth is, excuse me for butting in, David, the John Wayne myth is
No,
sort
quite
of
all right. That's what I want you to do.
it's a cultural, it's what every man is supposed to be, right? And it's crazy. It's
Well, and y'all are bringing very valid points. The way I have said it and wrote an article on it years ago, but I've read Galatians 5, and meanness is not a fruit of the Spirit. And yet we have many Christians today that think meanness is the first characteristic of a Christian.
Yeah.
We don't like these people. We don't like these people. And as I used to say when I led the effort against fundamentalism, we were never saying they don't have a right to believe what they believe. That's the First Amendment. And it was interesting to hear Franklin Graham after the Supreme Court ruling that didn't go his way in relation to LGBTQ issues and job discrimination, et cetera. He said, I have a right to believe these things. And my thought was, you're absolutely right. You have every right to believe those things. But you don't have a right to be mean in the name of Jesus and tell other people they have to live with the same value system you live.
That's right.
All we ever said to fundamentalists was, let's all have a seat at the table.
Right.
Let's continue to work together despite the differences. But as I've often described it, if you had to build a bridge over a 100-yard river, you could build 99 yards of that bridge. But the fundamentalist would not build the 1 yard to you, because to do so was to compromise. To do so was to be weak. And their whole attitude was, we're right, you're wrong. If you don't agree with us, you don't believe the Bible. If you don't agree with us, you don't believe in Jesus. I respect these folks' right to believe that. They're reading scripture differently than me. And they have a right to live that in their personal lives. But they don't have a right to force that on the rest of America that was founded on the very principles of, we don't want anybody to do that in the name of God. We don't want anyone to tell us what we can believe and not believe as Americans. And that's the whole essence of the First Amendment and the separation of church and state that goes with it. And with that, of course, we have other issues which comes to the worth of an individual. And y'all bring up women, which is significant. Baptists are still fighting the issue of whether or not a woman can be a pastor.
Yeah.
In an age when we have women governors and senators and bank presidents and school superintendents and everything else.
And
It's nearly like
Vice
originalism.
President, thank you, Roger.
It's nearly like this effort of originalism with the Constitution. When that document was written, blacks were 3/5 of a person, women were nothing, didn't have a vote. And that's a living, breathing document. And the principles, I think, are amazing. But they have to be fleshed out in modern society. It's like saying, why didn't Jesus talk about airplanes? Well, he didn't know about airplanes, okay? I mean, it's just the reality of the situation. But the principles are there. When fleshed out, are living and breathing and bring us into modern society and bring us into to mutual respect for people. But again, just because I believe a woman can be a pastor, you don't have to agree with me. Just don't kick my church out of the convention, because I do. And of course, Bill, you're a member at Wilshire Baptist Church in Dallas, and that church was actually kicked out of the Texas convention over the gay issue. My son's a member there as well. And
yeah. So was First
so was First Austin, where Roger was pastor. These were core churches that helped fight fundamentalism. But Bill, talk to us a little bit about your work and your efforts in terms of your Christian values and how they express themselves in their political values.
Okay. Thank you, David. I appreciate the opportunity. And I have something written. Several of y'all have raised issues that I could go on and on about. I'm going to try to stick to the script, but I want to go back to what Jeanie said and others have touched on about this thing of, I love what she said, because I've said this for a long time about my faith informs my politics. And with some who call themselves Christians, I believe their politics totally informs their faith. It totally distorts how they view Jesus, like Father Joe was talking about a while ago. And I remember probably the worst moment I've ever had. I've been in church since I was a baby, so almost 70 years. Probably the worst moment I ever had in the church was in 2003 at our former church, about a year before we left it. And we've, fought the battles there for a long time, thinking we could kind of turn things around. Didn't. Finally realized it was hopeless. But on the eve of the Iraq War in 2003, the pastor used a Sunday morning sermon to launch a diatribe against what he called Hollywood liberals, who were critical of George W. Bush and calling George W. Bush stupid and so forth. And I actually called David Currie that week, told him about it, and David said, "Oh yeah, he got that off the internet. I've seen that going around." But anyway, he this long diatribe about Ed Asner and Susan Sarandon and so forth and so on, and then he wound it up by saying, "These George W. Bush isn't stupid. These people who are calling him stupid, they're the ones who are stupid." 70 years I've been in churches, almost since I was a baby. I have never seen the amens and the applause that went up that morning. I've never seen it for Jesus or anybody else that went up when that pastor said, "These people who are critical of George W. Bush going to war, they're the ones who are stupid." And I felt such a hatred in that room that morning, and felt so lonely. You know, it wasn't because I'm a Democrat. It was because this isn't about Jesus anymore. You know? Anyway, so I got off script there. I'm going to go back to my script so I can stay in the time limit as much as I
Fine,
can.
Bill. We appreciate it.
Yeah. But going back to what you said, as a committed Christian, I believe that my faith and my relationship with Christ are critical to everything I do, whether privately or publicly. As my understanding and relationship with Christ has evolved through the years, my commitment to the values that I believe are at the heart of the Democratic Party has grown stronger. As I reflected on the relationship between my faith and my politics in preparation for this discussion tonight, it struck me I'm a Baptist for much of the same reasons that I'm a Democrat. At the heart of the Baptist movement, which began a little over 400 years ago, when some British subjects rebelled at being required to support the established church, is the principle that all people stand equal before God. It is a democratic small d movement in which people come together in community, a church, to determine how they will be governed, how they will worship, and how they'll practice their faith, with each person having an equal voice in all of that. The Democratic Party lives by the same conviction that, as the Declaration of Independence says, all people truly are created equal and are entitled to an equal voice in their communities of citizens, whatever form those communities might take. Republican leaders today, whether at national, state, or local levels, are actively working to deprive some of their fellow citizens of their vote. They have rigged the system. According to findlaw.com, 14 states passed stricter voter ID laws in time for the 2016 election on the premise that they would prevent voter fraud. However, research into voter fraud has found that it is exceedingly rare. In fact, from 2000 to 2014, a period during which over 1 billion votes were cast in the US, there were only 31 credible allegations of voter fraud. Voter ID laws, which require that a voter present a specific type of photo identification and proof of address, were passed on that flimsy basis. They targeted, of course, people who might not have access to such identification. So, for example, poor people, homeless people, people of color, the elderly, and young people barely of voting age found themselves unable to vote without going through an onerous process and quite possibly paying an onerous fee. Some of us are old enough to remember poll taxes and voter literacy tests required in the 19th and throughout much of the 20th century. They were ultimately outlawed because they violated that principle of equality. They purposely put some people on an unequal footing, making it harder for them to vote and ultimately preventing them from voting at all. That's why Democrats have fought hard to defeat voter ID laws in the legislatures, and failing that, to have the courts overturn them, because Democrats want all eligible voters to have a voice in the governing of our nation. The real voter fraud today is voter suppression, and that is a Republican product. It's not only a denial of our national principles, but our faith values as well. Reverend William Barber, longtime pastor of Greenleaf Christian Church in Goldsboro, North Carolina, and co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, calls voter suppression efforts, quote, acts of sin because they deny the humanity and citizenship inherent in voter status, suggesting that you're not a person. That suppression, he continues, is saying that someone has the right to diminish the imago Dei, image of God, in all of us. Voter suppression is idolatry, a form of political self-worship. The church cannot be quiet on that matter, because to suppress our vote is political sin. Over the years, Democrats have demonstrated a commitment to the common good, the good of all people, not just the privileged few. It's been Democrats who have made good paying jobs a priority, a living wage, good benefits, including affordable health care, trade policies that benefit working people, especially the family farms that put food on our nation's family tables. Democrats have been committed to tax policies based on a sense of our nation as community. Higher taxes for those who have benefited the most from our nation's economy, lower taxes for those who have not been so fortunate. I'll admit I lose patience with Republicans who are always seeking tax cuts for the rich and decrying taxes in general. It's our sense of community, that we're all in this together, pooling our resources for the betterment of all of our citizens, that has historically made our country so attractive to people seeking opportunity. One website asks the question, who benefits when taxes are collected? Then goes on to answer its own question in this way. Because no one lives in isolation, tax dollars from a variety of sources benefit you, your family, and your neighbors, no matter the size of income. Every time you get in your car and travel on a public highway, you ride on roads built, maintained, and paid for by state and local road funds, replenished by tax dollars. Your children and grandchildren who attend public schools benefit from tax dollars. When children are educated in well-funded school systems, everyone's quality of life is improved, and so is your community, your state, and your country. If you or your children attend a college or university, you benefit from taxes. In turn, college graduates qualify for better jobs and are less likely to be unemployed in a recessed or depressed economy. Tax dollars also pay to keep you safe through the funding of police and other law enforcement units. Tax dollars help families through the work of the Department of Health and Human Services. I would add to this list clean air and clean water, assurance that our food is safe through the work of the USDA, that the drugs we're prescribed are safe and effective through the work of the FDA. And I'm sure you can think of many more ways we all benefit from tax dollars. Joe Biden is committed to not raising taxes for those making less than $400,000, but he's also committed to reversing tax cuts on the wealthy so that we can start work on his plans to rebuild our crumbling bridges and roads and other infrastructure. Those things that work for the good of all of us, not just a few. I'll close by focusing on Democrats' commitment, and David has touched on this, to that historic Baptist principle of religious liberty. It was a Virginia Baptist pastor, John Leland, who pushed James Madison to put religious liberty at the forefront of the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Those brilliant 16 words encompassing two clauses, the no establishment clause, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, and the free exercise clause, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Historically, Baptists, remembering the persecution they have suffered for exercising their faith, had been committed to the strict separation of church and state, because such separation is good for both church and state. Sadly, some Baptists have strayed from that commitment in recent years. And by the way, David mentioned David Barton, our former church that I referred to a while ago, back in the 90s, showed the David Barton Wall Builders film. I don't know if all of you have ever seen that. Showed that in a Sunday evening worship service. That evening, I was so angry, I walked out without saying a word to anyone, just went straight to my car, called the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty the next day. They already had a response written, which I later learned that Brent Walker had written. He was counsel at that time before he became executive director. But anyway, yeah. So they've been straying from it for a long time, unfortunately. That is not Christians seeking governmental preference for Christians over others. Remember, Jesus said the first great commandment is to love the Lord your God. The second is to love your neighbor as yourself. Are we loving our neighbor as ourselves when we seek governmental favor at others' expense? My faith in Christ is not to be used as a political prop to gain votes and exercise power over others. The president recently walked from the White House to a nearby church for the sole purpose of having a photo taken of him holding a Bible aloft in front of the church building. Before his walk, however, he used law enforcement personnel as his own personal goons to clear the way for him by using tear gas to disperse a crowd of peaceful protesters. Love thy neighbor. Sadly, most Republicans and most of them Christians just look the other way. Some Baptist leaders identifying as Republicans actually praised the president for his, quote, display of faith. That's not Christianity. And it's just one more reason that I'm voting Democratic. For me, it's all about Jesus. The Democratic Party is not a church, and it has many people who do not share my faith, some even who profess no religious faith at all. But when I look at the principles and actions of the Democratic Party, reaching out to lift up those who have been left behind, bringing together people in community to work for the good of all people, not just themselves, insisting on religious liberty for all people, it looks a lot like Jesus.
Bill, thank you very much.
Wow.
Certainly prepared well and certainly articulate. 2 or 3 things, the definition of religious liberty to the Ted Cruz's of the world is my right to be mean in the name of Jesus. That expression of faith, when it's meant to be your right to believe and worship as you choose, but not discriminate. It's interesting how these issues of Christian ethics and religious liberty and other items end up coming back to the way we treat people of other races. Roger Paynter's been very active in race relations for many years, both in Jackson, Mississippi and in Austin. One of the things I like to brag about is I've been to all 30 baseball stadiums, and my 29th a couple of years ago was Cincinnati. Well, I go to Cincinnati by myself. I'm just flying up there, and lo and behold, the Museum of the Underground Railroad is in Cincinnati, and it's fascinating. It is beautiful. It is wonderful. And I learned history I did not know about how shortly after the Civil War, all throughout the South were Black mayors and Black city council members and Black elected officials, all of which disappeared with the end of Reconstruction and the start of Jim Crow. And that the voter suppression is still a part of the same thing. Bill and I are similar ages, and I remember the poll tax when I was a child. And these efforts to keep people of color from being able to vote. Martin Luther King was, in my opinion, the greatest American of the 20th century. And I've always felt that way and believe it more today than ever before. But our country still deals tremendously with systematic racism. And as Mark Wingfield, the new head of Associated Baptist Press, does it have a different name now that I'm forgetting, Bill?
Baptist News Global. Baptist News
Okay,
Global.
I knew it was a new name. When you've been around as long as I have, you remember all the old names, before they got there. Wrote this great article that I shared on Facebook and others. You can't be a Christian in a racist, period. Period. Just end of discussion. Racism and Christianity do not go together. And we've got a party really practicing racism. And I know there's some minorities that support some of that, but I can't wrap my mind around that, to be honest with you. And Roger, I'd like for you to address some of the work you've done in race relations and some of the things you think Democrats should do. And then I want to come back at the end. I want to talk a little bit about if Amy Barrett, is that her name, is appointed, how do Democrats deal with that? This talk about court packing, which is a joke. Nobody wants to pack the courts. There's going to be some need to balance the courts, obviously, because 15 of the 19 last Supreme Court justices have been appointed by Republicans. So it's a pretty packed court right now.
Yep.
And it's going to need some balancing. And I hope the Democrats are going to have the courage to do that in a way to keep us moving toward middle ground where we can work together. But we'll discuss that in a minute. Roger, talk to us some about the issue of systematic racism and the work you've done throughout your entire Christian ministry.
Sure. Thanks, David. When I was pastor of Northminster Baptist Church in Jackson, Mississippi, the mayor of the city, a man with the great Southern name of Cain Ditto, That sounds like a novel. Kane was the mayor of our community, and he asked me if I would head up an organization called a racial reconciliation group and co-chair with an African American pastor, which I did. And then we also entered into a year study with an organization that had come out of Atlanta to Jackson to just talk about what's the difference in an old Jackson and a new Jackson. And much of it was around race issues. There were 30 people in that group, and 15 were white and 15 were African American. It took me a while to find if there are any other diverse race groups in Mississippi than just white and black. And there weren't many. I found a few Oriental groups who were brought in to work in certain industries that were less than humane, quite honestly. But this pastor and I began to talk about this. And then later I moved to Austin, and First Baptist Austin had, of all things, the mayor of Austin in it. So once again, the mayor of Austin knew that I had been working in this role in Northminster. So he decided to have a racial reconciliation group in Austin and had me co-chair that with a Baptist minister here in Austin, and we began to work with as racial reconciliation. We began to work with a peacemaking group out of South Africa that had dealt with the issue of apartheid, and we did a lot of learning and listening for much of the year, and broke up into some small groups, and had a lot of interaction between clergy from different racial backgrounds. And one of the most interesting things for me, and I won't go into a long time about this, but I thought that naively that in Jackson, I would encounter more racial difficulties and less racial difficulties in Austin. Jackson's from the South, and much of the racial violence that happened during the Civil Rights era was in Jackson, actually, Mississippi as a whole. Austin's a good liberal community, and everybody gets along, and everybody loves each other. And what I found after shutting my mouth and listening to different members of the African American communities in both cities is that Jackson was much farther along in racial reconciliation and had done much more dealing with it. They had more honest about it, and honest about their own bigotry, their own prejudice, black against white, white against black. And they were willing to do more honest talking and do more constructive work than they ever were in Austin, because the white liberal perspective in Austin was considered by the basically black community of Austin to just be phony. And they were just sick and tired of all the focus on the great progressive music scene and all these things in Austin that had no benefit for the African American community whatsoever. And I encountered much more anger in Austin than I ever did in Mississippi, which was just unusual to me. You mentioned, David, this thing you encountered in Cincinnati. I'm from Oklahoma City, or Ardmore, and then Oklahoma City. And one of the things I never knew about in Oklahoma growing up was what happened in Tulsa. And you saw more about it with Trump going to speak to Tulsa, and unfortunately falling on his face in that city. Hooray for them. But there was I learned, tried to read as much as I could. There was a huge amount of black leadership in the city of Tulsa, on the west side of Tulsa. And there was a lot of great businesses. There were fair wages being paid. There was a structure, governmental structure, and all kinds of things. And they just were attacked by white citizens and slaughtered. They were killed and burned, and their businesses were burned. And now they have a very, interestingly, a very progressive Republican mayor of Tulsa who is trying to actually find some of the graves and stuff. They just had a bulldozer of pushing black bodies into huge holes in the ground and covering them up. And it is the most shameful history of any city, I think, in terms of race relations. And I always thought, well, that's not Oklahoma, that's Alabama or something. No, 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 it's my home state that did that. So what I did in preparation for this, I called Jonathan Favors Grimes, and Jonathan is a 26-year-old African-American friend of mine who is a student at Emory Seminary for most of the year, and then he spends a semester every other year at Union Seminary, New York. And I told him the other day I thought he was working on a 3-year seminary plan with a 6-year cycle somehow. He's taken so many classes, but he's a brilliant young man. And he was a member of First Decatur when I was interim there, and we became great friends. And I asked him, tell me a little bit about the Black Lives Movement, you know, from your perspective. And you know, the notion that the Black Lives Movement, as we've seen it, and the Black Lives reality are two different things, that the media is just blowing into a war almost. And the Republicans have taken advantage of that. Mm-hmm. And they tried to divide these groups against each other and say, well, Black Lives Matter are people who burn buildings and all this sort of stuff. And that is such a small minority of thing that's happening. And there's so many good things that are happening in the Black Lives Movement. Many, honestly, from the support of the National Basketball Association, the pandemic and building that thing in Disney of all those black athletes being together has been one of the greatest things for the Black Lives Matter movement that could have happened. And I don't know what you think of LeBron James, but I think he's a pretty awesome human being for the leadership he's taking. But he's talking about how many people haven't been included, other than, you know, he was talking about his fear of what might happen if Trump were to win the election, or even if Trump loses. He said the stewardship of privilege is what we have to work on. You know, that's not what anything that the white community is spending time on, but we need to think about the stewardship of privilege. And he said women and African Americans and immigrants and LGBT and indigenous people and on will just be shoved to the side and left out. Not so much by Joe Biden, but by the reaction to Joe Biden. And he fears the violence of all that. He talked about voter suppression for a while and how that's being tweaked in so many ways, but still a business. I was in conversation earlier today with a friend in Mississippi and asked what was going on in Mississippi about that. And they said, well, you know, there's no poll tax, but everybody who votes has to get a notary public to sign their ballot. Did you know that? Oh, there's no poll tax. You know, how many people have a notary public at hand? Yeah. You know, it's stunning. Anyway, he was talking about the races in Atlanta, where he lives, or Decatur. And then he just talked about I said, what are the differences in your mind between African Americans, males, and white males? And he said, African Americans, male, primary response is fear. And the white primary response is pride and fear. Fear that they will lose their privilege, pride in their accomplishments, fear that Black people will take over, fear that Black people will become their bosses. And African Americans have a fear they cannot ever fully be themselves, even in their own workplaces. They are not given credit for whatever they do. There's a crippling effect that they are less than because they had 400 years of being 3/5 of a person. And he said, and one of the worst things that's going on in the Black community always is they make achievements like they did sometimes during the 70s and 60s. And then they're comfortable and they forget they have to keep fighting. They never can give up fighting. And so those are just some of the things that Jonathan said. and I look at some of the let's see, where I wrote this down. The whole thing of not ever being fully included in our country, and not ever being valued as an equal citizen, and that even in the most progressive white people, there are these moments, and God, I hate to admit this on on television or whatever, that I have these moments myself when I just think, well, I wonder if that person's as qualified, and I wonder if or watching an interview with a Black leader and thinking, wow, doesn't he have a good vocabulary? Isn't he well spoken? Isn't he thoughtful? Isn't she something other than just a beautiful singer? She's really a very thoughtful scientist of all things. Just that junk is in all of our heads, and all of our hearts. And I think the Democrats are trying to be more honest and look at this more seriously. And obviously, the Republicans have just not done a dadgum thing to help this or to help our country heal. They've just stirred up fights and races and lied about all these this protest. I mean, I went down to the protest in Austin against the police, and one thing I did, because First Baptist Church was just a block away, and I didn't think our current pastor would go down there and look. He didn't, but I wanted to make sure that the church wasn't damaged, and so when I was there, I found that, oh my goodness, that was an incredibly peaceful protest for a week, for 2 weeks. There were a few people injured. There were a few store windows broken out, mostly by young white people living in Austin. People, a lot of them by people on the street who have other issues that they're dealing with. And there were actually very few African Americans in that protest. I would count, I went to a couple of nights and I would count 12, 13, 14 of them, and maybe 500 or 2,000 white kids, all protesting the police, and the police with all their, no conversation from the police. The Austin police were horrible. They had their riot gear out all the time and shooting rubber bullets and hurting, and most of the wounds were of white people. So it just, there's just so many miles yet to go. But I do think the Black Lives Matter issue is something we Democrats have to get behind. And none of this all lives matter stuff, because that immediately says, but well, they don't really mean Black lives when they say that. And that's why we have to focus on Black lives, to let them know they matter to us. So I'm kind of going off the cuff, David, but I just
That's all right.
Really passionate about this and upset. And I've just been working on this for years, and I find that most of my friends who are African American ministers are incredibly frustrated and angry and frightened and upset that their church is going to be disrupted. Some of them just out of a conservative side, feeling like, we're getting too liberal in the Black community. But the other ones who are in the more progressive denominations feeling like, what does it matter? What does it matter? And so their hope is being diminished. And that is something we cannot tolerate. We cannot diminish hope. We have to give people reasons,
Amen.
To risk and to try something fresh and new, and and do something for their people, for their movement, for their humanity. All right, end of sermon.
Roger, thank you.
Yeah.
Let me say a word here. We just had someone on text. Oh my goodness, I've kind of lost everybody for a second. Okay, now let me get back here. Roger, thank you. That was passionate and it came from your heart. Someone just asked in chat, Shirley, about he was a Baptist deacon, really enjoying this. He had to leave. How can he share this with others? What do I need to tell folks about how they can share this presentation with other folks? Can you address that, or how do we do that?
Yes, I'll email all the attendees a link to the YouTube video when I get it posted on video, and I'll also post it on our Turn Rural Texas Blue Facebook page from YouTube.
Well, thank you. Yes, Turn Rural Texas Blue is the place to go to that. It's the non-urban rural caucus for the state Democratic Party that I'm chair of. Carl Jones has been on with us. He's our field coordinator and very active and a wonderful person. Carl asked a question a while ago. If we actually win the presidency and take control of the Senate and the House, can we still accomplish anything with this Supreme Court? And that's an interesting question for me, because the separation of government, it nearly seems like anything done has to be approved by the Supreme Court now. And I didn't really realize that they had that power over all legislation. And Joe, you've got it raising your finger. Would you want to address that a second?
If you don't mind, David, I'd like to. Let's say that Joe Biden wins and the Democrats take the Senate, which I think the numbers percentage-wise are looking that way. Where the Supreme Court, with the overwhelming packing, as you had put it, that Republicans, especially Trump, and the other courts, by the way, everybody talks about Trump. Trump's not our problem. It's Mitch McConnell and it's the Republican enablers. Those are the problems. Everybody knew what Trump was when he was elected. We shouldn't be surprised by that. That being said, if Joe Biden and the Democratic leadership in the House and the Senate can legislate and do so in a way that doesn't block the other side but brings them in, then we don't need the high court. The high court becomes useless in this, except for those people who are going to look for a fight and try and find a way to manipulate around the legislation. But good legislating means that the Supreme Court isn't going to have to be that important. And the minority has to play a role, because even if Amy Barrett is confirmed, which we're not sure right now with the numbers because of the number of Republican senators with COVID and are in quarantine. We don't know that she has the numbers. So that's the other thing to keep in mind. But even if she is confirmed, 6 justices don't necessarily mean anything if the Chief Justice, who I wasn't a fan of him at first, but I think he's bigger than the politics. And I think we're going to see some courage out of the Chief Justice. That being said, again, if the Democrats can legislate and they do so in a way that's all-encompassing, then the courts don't become a thing.
Joe, can I ask you a question?
Well, I agree with that. I also do feel like that we, as wanting to work across the aisle people, I know in Baptist life, my moderate friends, they just kept saying, we can work together, we can work together, we can work together, and you can't work with fundamentalists. No, because they won't work with you.
Sure.
And I'm concerned about that.
Well, but David, here's
I do think that should we win, I do think we do add other states.
No, but David, here's the other side of that coin. And I'm not disagreeing with you, but I am arguing that given the state of the GOP under Donald Trump, most of the extremists are being or will be filed out on November 3rd. I mean, there may be a couple hangers on, but when the fact that John Cornyn is in a statistical tie in Texas with MJ Hager, I mean, that says something. This is Texas. The fact that North Carolina, Trump is in a statistical tie with Joe Biden, North Carolina. Roger and I were talking about Jamie Harrison before we started recording. Jamie Harrison is 2 points above Lindsey Graham. I mean, this is a whole different universe than we were in 2 years ago, let alone 4 years ago. And so it's because so many people are upset by what Roger referred to, and Bill, you referred to this so brilliantly in your comments too, the lack of dignity and the lack of humanity that exists. And the American people, for whatever their weaknesses and for whatever, not their, whatever our weaknesses, whatever our foibles, whatever our failings, we are good and decent people. And we don't like when indecency and inhumanity is forced on us. And I think we're going to see that from across the board.
Joe, can I ask
Well,
you a
that's
question?
the hope, Joe.
Sure,
If we
Roger.
don't see that, then it's a very scary time. Go ahead, Roger.
Well, David, if we don't see that, then you know, my wife and I are moving to Fiji.
Not alone, buddy.
Yeah, Roger, we've got an extra
Roger,
room.
go.
Yeah, yeah, right. Joe, I liked your comments about the court, and I've loved following the court even from the time I've been a kid and figuring out all of what they were doing and stuff. And one of the things that's always surprised me and been reassuring is how many of the justices aren't very that predictable when they get on the
That's
court.
right.
Right.
That's right.
And you know, conservatives vote liberal and liberals vote conservative or whatever. But I'm like you, I want to trust the Chief Justice. I do. And I like what he just did, you know, where it was a tie.
Yep.
If Biden is in the White House, do you think he will be strengthened in his ability to vote differently or not be the automatic Republican response?
The Chief Justice?
Yeah.
Look, are you kidding? I think, look, Gorsuch is not a Trumpian Republican.
Yeah.
Kavanaugh, I Pontius Pilate Kavanaugh. But Gorsuch is a thinker. So
Yeah.
Gorsuch is going to end up being another Kennedy in my perspective.
Yeah.
He's going to go the right way of the law. And I think the Chief Justice is going to do the same thing. And in a certain sense, I think they're going to breathe a heavy sigh of relief with Trump being gone, because then it becomes about rule of law and not pleasing the autocrat in the Oval. My wife and I got into a little bit of a tiff the other day, because she's like, how does Amy Barrett not know the 5 basic freedoms? And I'm like, no, you're missing the point. She knows them. It's law school 101. She purposely didn't answer that question because the person who appointed her, and in the world of Trump, there is only an audience of one.
Yeah.
In the world of Trump, who has decimated all of those rights. And remember which one she didn't remember? The right to protest. That's not accidental.
Okay.
Because what's the one thing he hates more than anything? Protests against him. So she forgets the right to protest, and none of the Republican senators can remember it either. Shock, surprise, dismay. And so, we'll not worry about that, because I think even she was thinking, yeah, I'm going to be on the court and I don't have to worry about him in what? We're 1.5 Scaramucci's away from the election.
Let me close with that. We're past an hour. I think here's the biggest thing we can say to anyone watching it: go vote. Please go vote.
Please.
Because imagine the Supreme Court overturning the Affordable Care Act after Joe Biden's won an election by 8 to 10 million votes, after the Senate has gone Democrat, after the Republicans have added 6 or 7 new representatives, after we've carried Georgia and Texas and Ohio and Iowa and North Carolina and Florida, and Biden has 400 electoral votes. How do you then, 1 week later on November 10th, overturn the Affordable Care Act when America has spoken, and spoken loudly and clearly? So if you can hear anything that you can think of to go tell people, is vote, 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 make sure you vote. Because that is 101 for me, as both a Christian and a Democrat, is the right of the individual to live, to believe what they believe, and live that out as long as it doesn't hurt other people. We just have a lot of people getting hurt right now
Yeah.
in the name of government and in the name of God.
Yeah.
So thank you. This was an interesting group. It's an early group. I'd say we also do this once a month, just talk to each other. It was a fun time. Thank you, Shirley, for helping us put it together. Thank Roger, Jeannie, Bill, and Joe for being on with me. And make sure you vote. Let's celebrate on November 4th. Thank you very much.
David, thanks very much. It was a pleasure.
Leave meeting. I'm going. You
This
bet.
is wonderful. Good seeing y'all.
Good seeing you.
Thanks,
I'm
Bill.
leaving meeting. Thank y'all.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.